Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those joining from the occupied Palestinian territories, Israel, and around the world. My name is Zaha Hassan, and I'm a human rights lawyer and fellow here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. If you're tuning into this program today, it's likely that you know something about the U.S. Visa Waiver Program. For those who don't, the U.S. Visa Waiver Program allows most citizens and nationals of qualifying countries to travel to the United States without having to first obtain a visitor's visa from a U.S. embassy or consulate in their home country, saving them considerable time and money. Before being admitted into this very privileged program, a country has to meet certain criteria. It has to have a visa denial rate for its citizens and nationals seeking entry to the United States that is under 3% of all applications submitted. It must execute agreements to share information and data with the United States on its citizens or nationals, and it must institute various security-related measures. And it must ensure that it provides the same benefits and privileges to U.S. travelers that the United States bestows on foreign travelers visiting our shores. So recently, the United States announced that Israel had met one of the requirements for admission to the program. The visa denial rate for its citizens is now under 3%. A requirement that is presenting more of a challenge for Israel to meet is the one concerning ensuring equal treatment of U.S. citizens and nationals as the U.S. affords Israelis. For many years now, the State Department has been documenting in its annual human rights country reports and in its travel advisories that Israel discriminates against U.S. citizens and nationals traveling through Israeli-controlled ports of entry on the basis of their national origin, religion, and ethnic identity. The report says specifically that Arab Americans, particularly those of Palestinian extraction, and Muslims can be expected to be treated poorly and may be arbitrarily denied entry. Members of Congress and their staff have not been immune. In 2018, U.S. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib of Palestinian descent was denied entry into Israel and the West Bank. And in 2016, Representative Mark Pocan and two other members of Congress were denied entry to Gaza on a mission to visit a UN school funded by the United States. Now, Representative Pocan was told at the time that he and his delegation did not fit the criteria for entry to Gaza, though no specific criteria was ever provided to him and the other congressmen. Last year, with Israel's application to the Visa Waiver Program pending, Israel's Coordinator for Government Affairs in the Territories, or COGAT, the military administrator for the occupied territories, published a new military policy that applies to all foreign entry into the West Bank, including for short visits. The policy severely restricts the categories of visitors who will be allowed to enter the West Bank on a visitor's visa and limits them to travel only through the land crossing with Jordan rather than through the Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. On their face, the new entry restrictions do not discriminate against travelers. Instead, a traveler's terms and conditions for entry are different based on the identity of the person they are visiting and where they intend to go. So if you're visiting a Palestinian in Ramallah, the military policy applies to you. But if you are visiting an Israeli living in a West Bank settlement, Israeli civil law applies to you and your travel is not subject to the severe restrictions. That's just in the West Bank. Now, travel to the Gaza Strip has been completely shut off from U.S. travel for more than 15 years now. Today's program, Blue Means Blue, Reciprocity, Israel, and the U.S. Visa Waiver Program is aimed at understanding the legal and the political context for the disparate treatment of Americans visiting the occupied Palestinian territories and Israel. We'll also take a deeper look at the COGAT military policy and how it impacts short visits to the West Bank and, by extension, Israel's eligibility for the U.S. Visa Waiver Program. The program could very well be a win-win-win for the U.S., Israel, and travelers, particularly Palestinian Americans, if the criteria for entry are met. So we'll discuss how to make that happen today. So with us are four guests. Jessica Montel is the Executive Director of HaMoked, an Israeli NGO that provides free legal aid to Palestinians living under occupation. HaMoked also engages in strategic litigation to compel Israel's compliance with its international legal responsibilities as an occupying power and under human rights law in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. After we hear from Jessica, we're going to hear from Leora Bechor, who is an Israeli licensed attorney and immigration law expert. She's currently challenging Israel's foreign entry restrictions, including the COGAT military policy I just mentioned. Samar Asad Hawari is married to a Palestinian ID holder and is a mother of 3. Formerly, she was the executive director of the Jerusalem Fund in Washington, D.C., and before that, a journalist for the Associated Press in Jerusalem. Kamal Nawash is a Jerusalemite whose residency rights were revoked in the 1980s by Israel. He now only holds U.S. citizenship. Kamal works as an attorney in Washington, D.C. He was recently denied entry to the West Bank this last summer for the first time. Now, before we begin this program, I want to encourage folks watching to tweet out about the program using @Carnegie Endow. Also, please use the hashtag #BlueIsBlue in your tweets. I also encourage you to tell your stories about your own experiences traveling to the occupied territories and Israel using the chat feature. You can also send me questions through that chat feature as well that I could ask the guests throughout the program. And just a quick disclaimer, I know there will be many tuning in today who have faced difficulties visiting Israel and the occupied territories. While we hope that we can shed light on some of these issues during the program, we cannot give legal advice on your specific cases during this program. So with that, Jessica, let's start with you. Would you please set the scene for us a bit? What is the political and legal context for the disparate treatment of foreign travelers to the occupied territories? Also, could you tell us what some of the differences are between entry to Israel or the Israeli settlements versus entry to the occupied territories? And what is your organization doing on this issue?
Yes, so thanks for having me. The West Bank and Gaza Strip are under Israeli military occupation. That's the starting point. And what that means for our purposes, I mean, there are a lot of dramatic events taking place that are headline news here. But for the entire Palestinian population, occupation is a permit bureaucracy. You need a permit from the Israeli military to do all sorts of daily life functions that the rest of us, I live in West Jerusalem in Israel, or you, people living in the United States, take for granted and can do, freely. And for our purposes, I'm going to talk about 2 different aspects of this permit bureaucracy. One is the control of the population registry, and the other is control of movement, both inside the territories and accessing the territories from abroad. So the Palestinian Population Registry, which is nominally managed by the Palestinian Authority, in fact, Israel has the ultimate control over any changes to the population registry. So new births and deaths are registered as a matter of course. But if the PA wants to grant, say, family unification to a foreign spouse who marries a Palestinian, Israel refuses to accept those changes. So what that means is Israel decides basically who is a Palestinian and whether or not a foreigner could be naturalized. I mean, a person who marries a Palestinian, moves to the West Bank, lives in the West Bank for 20 years, owns a home, sends their children to Palestinian schools, works in a Palestinian organization. At no point is that person naturalized as a Palestinian. They always remain a foreigner as far as Israel is concerned and need a special permit to be living in the West Bank. And you have tens of thousands of people living in the West Bank who are considered illegal aliens because they don't get that permit and they're afraid to leave and then not be allowed back to their family. And the second aspect of control that I want to touch on very briefly is freedom of movement. And you have all sorts of restrictions on Palestinians moving the occupied Palestinian territories have been bifurcated. And then it is difficult for Palestinians to move from the West Bank to East Jerusalem, from either of those two areas to Gaza. You need special permits. And also to move in and out, to travel abroad, Palestinians who can be banned from travel or have to be subject to the Israeli military restrictions for travel. And what's important for me to mention is all of the restrictions. Well, the West Bank in its entirety is under Israeli military occupation. But we know that over 500,000 Israelis are living in settlements in occupied territory. They're also theoretically under military law, but military orders have made those settlements look and feel like Israel. And also when it comes to freedom of movement, they are excluded from a lot of the restrictions on movement that Palestinians are subjected to. So you have in the same territory, two populations living side by side, governed by two completely different and very discriminatory legal systems. When it comes to criminal justice, when it comes to freedom of movement, building and planning, access to water, really the whole spectrum of issues. And this discrimination, this blatant distinction between Palestinians as opposed to settlers in terms of rights and benefits is now also recreated when you're talking about travel to the West Bank. So people coming from abroad who want to access a settlement in the West Bank travel freely. They can travel to Ben Gurion Airport, get in a taxi cab and go to a settlement. People who want to visit a Palestinian community in the West Bank are subject to entirely different set of regulations. So, that, and obviously that is right away a flag for this reciprocity and the basic sort of equality that is mandated in the visa waiver program. And all of these restrictions, including the restrictions, these new military entry restrictions on foreigners coming, the main victim are Palestinians. We have identified the motivations for these restrictions on foreigners entering the West Bank. It's demographic engineering because it's the main victims, as I said, are these families who can't get any legal status for a foreign spouse and then are not able to live together legally. And it's an isolation of Palestinian society, making it very difficult for students, teachers, volunteers, workers, investors, all of the ways that Palestinian society could and should benefit from contact with the outside world. All of those things are now restricted by these entry restrictions of the Israeli military. So HaMoked got into this issue because we are supporting Palestinian victims of human rights violations, both through individual cases and trying to challenge broader policies that harm Palestinians. But of course, the reason we're here today is because these regulations are also really dramatically affecting foreign citizens who have any connection to Palestinians or Palestinian society or want to come visit the West Bank for any reason.
My opening remarks, Jessica, Gaza is currently completely cut off from U.S. travelers if they transit through Israel because of another military policy pertaining to travel to Gaza through Israel. Instead, U.S. citizens generally have to transit through Egypt via the Sinai, which is long and arduous. Because all U.S. citizens are prevented from traveling there, there is an argument that there is no discrimination against U.S. Citizens and nationals because all U.S. citizens are treated equally, and all are not allowed to enter Gaza. However, reciprocity also requires that Israel also allow transit of U.S. citizens. Gaza is not Israeli sovereign territory; it's occupied. So, theoretically, Israel should not prevent travel through Israel to Gaza. For example, we don't prevent Israeli citizens from having a layover in Chicago before going on to their final destination in Vancouver, Canada. So if there is to be true reciprocity, then it seems to me that Israel should allow U.S. travelers to transit to Gaza. Now, many U.S. travelers to the West Bank are concerned about the Gazification of the West Bank, meaning that they're afraid that at some point travel is going to be completely shut down to foreign nationals who want to visit family, friends, or have business associations in the West Bank. Is it possible can you practically shut down the West Bank to all foreign travelers so that even those visiting Israeli settlements wouldn't be allowed entry? Or is there a way to make an exception for those visiting Israeli settlements?
Well, I mean, even today, when you land at Ben Gurion Airport or you come to the Allenby Bridge crossing with Jordan, and they ask you for the purpose of your visit, right away there is a distinction made if you're going to Israel, or you're going to settlements, or you're going to visit Palestinians or Palestinian institutions. And theoretically, I mean, as it is now, it is much more restrictive to access Palestinian communities than visit settlers or Israelis inside Israel. Theoretically, those restrictions could be made even harsher. I mean, the border between the West Bank and Israel is porous. So if people are inside Israel, it would be difficult at this point to control movement into the West Bank. But people coming from abroad, I mean, as we have seen, the restrictions are getting more and more difficult to be accessing Palestinian communities in the West Bank, whereas it's perfectly free to be accessing settlements. So it would be a very dramatic step to be turning movement to the West Bank into the situation, the extreme military blockade of Gaza. But I think we do have to be concerned about harsher measures to be isolating Palestinian society.
Thank you. In particular, because we have a new minister responsible, right, for the foreign entry to the West Bank, and that's Bezalel Smotrich. Do you believe that the enforcement of these rules or policy will be harsher under his administration, or are we already seeing that?
Well, it's a huge concern. I mean, one of the politicians who is the most extreme in ultra-nationalist, religious fundamentalist positions is now in charge of the civil administration and COGAT, the bodies responsible for the welfare of the Palestinian population, as well as for settlers and settlements. And we've already seen that he is working as hard as he can to be giving all the benefits to settlements. In fact, he wants to, annex, if not formally, then functionally, all of the areas that the military now controls in terms of settlements. What that means in terms of the Palestinians, it is still hard to say, but he has been given direct responsibility. He will appoint the next head of the civil administration and the next head of COGAT. So it's likely that those will be again, ultra-nationalist, extreme religious figures who are not at all sympathetic to Palestinian basic rights, not at all concerned about respecting international law, and promoting this agenda that says, the West Bank belongs to Israel and should be used solely for the benefit of Israelis. So that should be a big concern for everyone.
Thanks, Jessica. I want to bring Leora in now, if we could. Hello, Leora.
Hi, Zaha.
Thanks for being with us. Could you talk about the COGAT policy and how it impacts the ability, specifically how it impacts the ability of people to enter the West Bank for short visits? And please talk a bit about your litigation that you're pursuing to challenge this COGAT policies.
Sure. Firstly, thank you. Thank you so much for having me and letting me be part of this conversation. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So I'm just going to go straight into it. The COGAT restrictions, it's a new policy called the Policy on Entry and Residence of Foreigners into the Judea and Samaria area, which is the West Bank. That's the term that the Israeli government uses. The policy was published in February of 2022, and it went into effect in late October 2022. There was an earlier policy that was in effect from the beginning of 2007 until October. It was a 3-page document, and now we're looking at a 60+ page document with appendixes, and we're looking at 90+ pages with a lot of legal jargon, very dense document that lists a whole range of categories and restrictions on entry into the West Bank. The document is for persons, foreign nationals from countries with diplomatic ties to Israel. It's not for nationals of countries without diplomatic ties. So obviously this policy does apply to Americans, and it sets out basically 3 categories of visitors: short-term visitors, long-term visitors, and then this separate category with their own rules, which are the spouses of Palestinians. So they have both short-term visas and long-term visas. I'm not going to actually address that because it's a world in and of itself. But I wanted to focus a bit on the short-term visitors. There is a closed list in the policy of who is allowed to come for a short visit. A short visit is a visit of under 90 days or up to 90 days, with the option of a renewal in very unique extenuating circumstances. So basically, you're looking at a up to 90-day permit. It could even be, you can arrive at the border and they may decide, no, we're going to give you 10 days. We're going to give you a month, 2 months. It's up to 90 days. It's not required to be 90 days. And the categories are first-degree relatives. First-degree relatives are spouses, parents, children, and siblings. They are not grandparents. They are not grandchildren. So they are only these categories, and siblings actually were only added after we had brought our litigation. They did amend the policy and they added the sibling category. Also, people who are allowed short-term visits are business people, investors, and recognized foreign journalists. That's it. No one else is on the list. So who isn't on the list? Tourists. There is no tourism to the West Bank under the policy. There's no such thing as coming to visit a friend, a roommate, an acquaintance, an old colleague. It doesn't exist. There is no option for extended family members, second or third degree relatives. You can't come to family weddings, funerals, summer vacation, summer holidays with your family. Doesn't exist under the policy. Also, with respect to the visits by first degree relatives, there is a condition that the first degree relative must be physically either residing in the West Bank or physically present in the West Bank during your visit. So let's say I'm an American wife married to a Palestinian husband. We live together. In Washington, and I'm going to visit his family. He has to stay and work. I have vacation. I'm going to visit his family. I'm not allowed to, because I need to bring the first degree Palestinian ID holder with me on the visit, or he has to be there when I'm visiting. So that also means no visits by in-laws. I can't go to see my mother-in-law. Similarly, let's say I'm an American spouse of a Palestinian. I live in Ramallah and I want my mother to visit me. But I myself am not Palestinian. My mother can't visit me because she is not the first degree relative of a Palestinian. And again, there's no grandchildren. So let's say a grandparent can't come to visit her grandchild and vice versa. So basically, we see a regime that doesn't make it possible for Palestinian Americans to be with their families in the West Bank, nor does it allow for proper family unification, because spouses who are living in the West Bank can't have their extended families visiting. So Palestinian Americans who don't hold IDs It's also important to remember that some of these people, let's say they live in the United States, they want to come during the summer. Many of these people actually were ID holders in the past. So some of them were born in the West Bank, had received IDs after 1967, and then moved to the United States. Maybe they moved for a PhD or whatever, or for immigration purposes, had their Palestinian IDs revoked. And now they're in a situation where they cannot go home and they cannot visit their families in the West Bank, because maybe in that case, they don't have any more living first degree relatives in Palestine. This is not an uncommon situation. But even where there is a first degree relative, the fact that they have to jump through hoops to visit the place where they are from, in and of itself is highly problematic. Now, the rules also for first degree relatives, so all the categories, the business people, the journalists, the first degree relatives, all those people can actually show up at the bridge, at the Allenby Bridge, which is a land border crossing with Jordan. They can show up and receive their visa to enter on the spot. But that is on condition that A, they have all the proper documentation to say they are, who they say they are, and B, that there is no prior history of denials. So if I am I'm taking an example of a spouse. If I'm a spouse and I had previously breached the terms of my visa, I had overstayed my visa, or I had been denied in the past, I cannot just show up. I must coordinate my entry in advance. It's also important to recognize all these people are receiving tourist visas. They're coming for visiting purposes. They're not coming for extended visits. They're coming for visiting family members or short-term visits, and they all receive what's called a B2 tourist visa. Their entry is only through the Allenby Bridge. They are not allowed to use the Ben Gurion Airport. I do want to also note that even though I listed all these categories of persons who are not eligible for visas, there is a humanitarian exception. So if you don't meet one of the criteria, but there is a strong foundation for you entering, you can submit your application, but there must be an application. There is no showing up at the Allenby Bridge and saying, I have a humanitarian need, let me in. You must submit your application in advance. So those are the general categories of short-term visitors. And then the long-term visitors, there are many people who are not included in the list. The list is very small. Long-term visitors are academics who are there, who want to be working in Palestine for an extended period of time, not for short-term conferences, not for workshops. University students, volunteers, INGO workers, experts, teachers, doctors, and investors in business persons. Everyone else is out. So again, also families. Everyone else is out. There are no artists. There are no athletes. There are no short-term academic conferences. Any other sphere of daily life, of civic life, is not included. The message...
Sorry to interrupt you, but so, it's kind of perplexing, because what you're saying is there's no tourism allowed, but Correct. The only thing you can get to enter is a tourist visa.
Right.
So, even a spouse who enters to be with their, a Palestinian ID holder has to keep renewing what is a visitor's visa for 90 days, right? So that's right. The only way you can stay. And if you don't get renewed, you're out, right? So one question I just wanted to ask you about the application that you have to fill out to enter the West Bank. Could you talk about what you need to declare in that application to be a tourist to come into the West Bank?
Okay, so first of all, now they've actually created different applications for different categories of visitors. But then there's also just the standard tourist, right? The short-term visitor versus the academic has to do a visa for the academic, for the volunteer, for whatever. But the short-term visitor has to say why they're coming. They have to provide IDs of their, let's say if it's a family member, they need phone numbers, they need names, they need IDs. All that information must be declared. They have to say where they're going. They need to say if there had been past visits. They have to say if there had been past denials. They have to often say like how many visits over the past 5 years. There was a clause in the original version, and then in the older policy that talked about land. Do you own land in the West Bank? And this raised a lot of red flags, especially for Palestinian Americans. There are many Palestinian Americans who own property in the West Bank. That clause actually doesn't exist. It's been removed. So that has been removed, but yes, there's still all the information that you have to provide about your family. And there always needs to be an inviter. There has to be someone local or a local institution who is inviting you to come in.
So to be clear, like someone who went to Jordan for a visit, maybe visited Petra and wanted to go visit the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem, they would not be able to do that through Allenby. They would have to, I mean, if they were coming to Bethlehem and then staying with family, they wouldn't be able to just do that as a tourist, right?
So staying with Palestinian family.
Yeah.
Right. If the family members were not first degree relatives, they wouldn't be granted access to the West Bank.
Okay. Thank you.
An important point that I should mention is that the policy does talk about what's called a mixed visit. A mixed visit means a visit to Israel and the West Bank. So many people say, well, as a tourist, I'm going to be visiting Israel and the West Bank. If that is the case, then they actually are allowed to enter through Ben Gurion Airport, and they are allowed to travel in both Israel and the West Bank. However, Israel has to be certain that that is exactly your intention. Just because you say, and it might be true that you are having a mixed visit, they may not believe you, in which case you may find yourself in the face of a denial. With both Muslim and Christian pilgrims, for example, pilgrims are not on the list, on the criteria of persons who are allowed short-term visits. It should be noted that they were on the list in 2007. So on the original old versions, pilgrims were on the list. They were removed, but most pilgrims are probably going to want to visit Israel and the West Bank because they're major, religious sites in both Israel and the West Bank for both religions. So that is a critical point, the issue of the mixed visits.
Okay. Thank you so much for that, Leora. I can see now that the COGAT rules are a bit of a problem if we're talking about short-term visits. Forget about, like you said, all the other ways in which it restricts people from being able to stay and live with their family members. But just as a short-term visit proposition, the COGAT rules are pretty central to the inquiry whether or not there's reciprocity. So I want to bring in like real live travelers now. Let's bring in Samar. Samar, you recently traveled with your family to the West Bank over the summer after the COGAT rules were first published. So can you talk about what your travel experience was like this last summer?
Thank you, Zaha, for having me, and thank you for putting this panel on. Yes, we traveled. Actually, our travel date was July 10th, which was a few days after I believe was the second postponement of the rules going into effect. The purpose for our visit was twofold. First of all, we like to travel every 3 years to visit family. But this summer in particular, my twins, my 15-year-old twins, were taking part in a summer camp that was put on by the Quakers out in Philadelphia. And this is a summer camp for Palestinian American kids aged 14 to 17. And obviously the purpose there is for them to be able to, visit Palestine, get to know the country, their traditions, mix in with the local kids, and travel throughout the country. The application process started in January, the deadline for the July camp. And part of the process, of the application process, there was a question that in addition to your U.S. passport, do you hold a West Bank ID? Now, the point for that was for those Arab American Palestinian kids who do have a West Bank ID, the Quakers needed enough time to submit paperwork for them to get a travel permit from the Israeli military in order for them to go to Jerusalem, to Tel Aviv, to Haifa, to Jaffa, to Akka, and the other trips that the camp had. At that point, my twins did not have their IDs, so we said no. The other problem was, now, how do we get there? Like you mentioned, I and my 3 kids do not have West Bank IDs. My husband does, and he is a US citizen as well. So traditionally what we do was, me and the kids would always go through Tel Aviv, and he would go through Jordan and cross over to through Allenby to the West Bank. Now, the question was, do me and the kids again travel through Israel, through Tel Aviv, risk being sent back because of these new rules? And if that happens, then what we would have to do is we would stay in the airport, what we would call airport jail, until the next flight out. And then he would be coming in through Jordan. Or do we go through Jordan with him and then have to go through travel, like we would have to go through Jordan, clear the airport, customs, passport control through Jordan, then drive 40 minutes to the Allenby Bridge, and then again there clear 3 different entities. First the Jordanians, again, customs, passport control, then the Israelis, passport control, customs, and then the Palestinians, and then still also being at a risk being sent back. We decided to go through Jordan and do that whole schlep only because if we were denied, me and the kids, entry in the second part of it, which was through the Israelis, then at least we will be able to go back with him to Jordan, stay at a hotel in Jordan, and reconsider our plans. We weren't sent back. We were asked what the purpose of our visit was. I had a cousin of mine who is a resident of Jerusalem. I had a copy of her Jerusalem ID, her Israeli license, driver's license, her address, her phone number, all with me. We told the woman at passport control, the Israeli passport control, that we would be staying with her. And she asked if we would be going to the West Bank. I said, yes, we would like to go visit Bethlehem, the church. And she asked, why? Are you Christian? And we responded, no. So what difference does it make? Anyway, we got the 3 months unrestricted visa and we entered. What happened though, the second trip that my kids were taken on the trip, they did not have that little permit that they got on the airport that said they had a visa and they were unrestricted. And so I was worried, as were the camp organizers, that they might be sent back at the Kalandia checkpoint. So I decided to follow the bus. We were going to Bethlehem, me and my older son, 19-year-old. And we decided, well, we'll just go to Bethlehem. We'll go through and go to Bethlehem. The bus, before it reached the Kalandia checkpoint, stopped, and then a bunch of kids got off. And then these kids are the actual Palestinian American kids who had West Bank IDs. They were a few feet away from the checkpoint. They were forced to get off the bus, walk all the way around through what we call a cattle run, because they had to then go through a separate kind of checkpoint, walking. And then they had to show their permits to travel and then take another bridge detour to meet the bus on the other side of the checkpoint. So I followed the bus with my kids, and lo and behold, I just see the bus move and my 2 twins, my 15-year-old, standing there. This is where I get emotional, sorry. Standing there, surrounded by Israeli soldiers and Israeli military police with M16s, told that they had to go back. I stopped the car, tried to get out of the car to tell them, hey, these are my kids. I get yelled at to go sit back in the car and wait. And one of the camp counselors came down with them as well, just to make sure that everything's okay. And he was telling them, this is their mom. And I said, look, they're 15-year-old kids. Don't know where their travel, their little permit or whatever, that the entry form that they gave. I don't know where they are, but look, we came in together. Here's mine. Their 19-year-old brother was in the passenger seat with me. I said, here's his. We have it. We came through Allenby. We have it. We have 3 months unrestricted. They're good to go. They're just kids. And they were like, no, they cannot. They have to go back. And I'm looking at my kids and they're terrified. And I'm back and forth with this soldier and they were getting irritated. And then I just had to sit back and say, calm down. Because at any point, what would stop them from arresting those two that they had with them, dragging the other 19-year-old out of the car? And so here I am begging them, pleading with them, telling them, come on, they're just kids. They're on a trip. What is the big deal? Why are you doing this? And then in the end, the counselor just told me, just calm down and all that. So I just told the soldier, I said, you know what? They don't need to go through. Just give me their passports. And mind you, at this time, I'm watching them and they're taking photos of these passports. And I'm saying, why are you taking photos of my kids' passports? Where are you sending them? Where are you uploading them? I said, just give me the passports back and they don't need to go. And all this time, there was one soldier, actually military force, who was just, we kept eye contact. And I would look at him every now and then I'd say, come on, please, just let them go. They're just kids. They just want to go on this trip. No reaction from him. Then I said, just give me the passports, let them get in the car. And I'm looking at my kids. Their eyes are like wallowing up with tears. And I'm just like, just give me their passports. They don't need to go. Just give me their passports. We'll get in the car and we will leave. And as they're handing the passports back and they're about to get into the car, one soldier yells out, the military police guy yells out to the soldier handing me the passport, something in Hebrew. And then he says, wait. Okay, fine. They're allowed to go. So they get in the car and I'm about to drive for them to meet where the bus is. And the soldier looks at the camp coordinator and he tells them, by the way, where is this trip that you guys are going? And he's like, oh, we're going to Tel Aviv. And he's like, why? It's boring. And then he looks at me and he goes to me, you put your kids through all this for a boring trip? And I just looked at him and I said, I did not put my kids through this. You're the one who put my kids through this.
So, I mean, what you're telling us, Asad, is that even if you get past Allenby Crossing, there's the internal checkpoint that also you need to contend with if you're an American or foreign traveler to the West Bank that's moving in between both the West Bank and Israel. I want to bring in Kamal now. Because time is short, and I do want to hear a bit about his experience. Also, you traveled, Kamal, this last summer after the COGAT rules were published. So could you talk to us about your trip with your family?
Yes, I can, but I'd like to take about a minute and a half to talk about my background because I think it is relevant. So I'm originally a Jerusalemite, and as you said, the first 2 years of my life, we lived in Jerusalem, and then later on, my parents moved to the West Bank, but I don't have a Jerusalem ID. I don't have a West Bank ID. The only thing I have is a U.S. passport because, as one of your commentators said, once you leave at that time, you don't get a chance to go back. And so I went back every year. I'm also married to a woman who has a Palestinian ID. She's on the Palestinian registry. And every year since we've been married, we go back to Israel, Palestine. Only this time around, this year, like no different. They went in the beginning of June, and usually I would go in July to pick them up. Usually she goes there to visit with the kids, to teach them Arabic, to visit around. It's just an overall, they like going there. So when I went back this time around, I go through Allenby for the same reason that Samar said, because the The last time that I went to Ben Gurion Airport was in 2005. And at that time, they kept me. At that time, I was actually invited by a church group to go there, and I was really excited to go with them. I got a free trip, only they kept me. Everyone else went relatively quickly, but when it came to me, they kept me for several hours, and they let me in the end. But I remember the customs person who told me, "Look, if you want to avoid this, don't come to Ben Gurion again. Go to Allenby." And since 2005, I've never gone to Ben Gurion. I always go through the miserable process of going through Allenby, which is really not any better than going through Ben Gurion. But the reason I also prefer Allenby is for the same reason as Samar did. The fear is if I go through Ben Gurion and they decide to let me go back, or if they don't let me in, I mean, just imagine after taking a 14 or 15-hour trip and you're exhausted, and then they tell you you have to stay in the airport until the next plane takes you back, and that's just an unfathomable idea. So I always go through Allenby just in case they don't let me in. I just go back to Jordan. So this time around, my family went in, my wife and kids went in as usual, as they do every year. And as usual, I went back and I went in July to pick them up. Only this time, I was asked very different questions than were normally asked of me. As I said, I go every year. This time, they asked me if I own property, which I do. I own a house there and I own land there. In addition, I was asked, but this time they also asked me if I have a Jordanian passport. Now, for those who don't know, since Israel took control of the West Bank in 1967, they don't consider Palestinians as citizens or even residents of Israel. Therefore, they have no ability to travel. And back then, there were only two ways you can do that. You can get something called laissez-passer. You could travel through Ben Gurion. That's, again, before the Oslo Accords. It's like a travel document. Or you can go through Jordan, and Jordan was nice enough to give Palestinians a Jordanian passport. But that Jordanian passport doesn't give you any rights in Jordan. It doesn't give you the right to be a resident. It doesn't give you the right to live there. It doesn't give you citizenship, certainly not. And so it's really for the purpose of just traveling. I had one that I inherited from my parents. I suspect that most Palestinians have one or have had one at some point. And so this time the soldier asked me, well, do you have a Jordanian passport, or do you have a right to get a Jordanian passport? Not thinking anything of it, I said, yeah, sure, I have one. And so he went away, came back a few minutes later, says, well, you cannot come in. We don't allow Jordanians into into Israel without a prior visa. And at that point, I said, well, I'm not a citizen of Jordan, nor am I a resident of Jordan. He went back again to talk to whoever, then came back and said, okay, we know you're not a citizen of Jordan. We know you're not a resident of Jordan, but for our purposes, we will consider you a citizen of Jordan, and you cannot come in. You need to go and you need to do several things in order to come in. You need to go give up this passport. First of all, I would have to find it, but I need to give it up and get documentations from Jordan that says that I gave up this passport, one. Number two, that I don't have the right to ever get one again. And, after I didn't really bother talking, pleading with him. I just said, look, I'm not a citizen. I'm not a resident. And it made no difference. I left. And this is a perfect example of what Samar said. I mean, had I come through Ben Gurion Airport with the same thing, it would have been an absolute nightmare. Yeah. In this situation, I just went back to Jordan, and And so I actually looked into how do I renounce my right to have this passport. So in Jordan, I couldn't figure it out. There was just no one knew anything about it or how to give up such a thing. So the minute I came to the United States, I made an appointment with the Jordanian embassy, and I went to them. I said, look, they prevented me from entering Israel. I need to give up my passport, and I need a letter from you that says I've given it up and I have no right to ever get one again. And they said, well, you're about the sixth person who came and told us this month. This has never happened before. We just started seeing that beginning in June of 2022. And the Jordanian government doesn't have any policy, any procedures where they either accept these passports or nor do we have procedures for giving verifications that you turned in this passport. And so the only option that I had, and keep in mind, I've had discussions with the U.S. Embassy prior to doing all this. It was the U.S. Embassy who had suggested to me that I go to the Jordanian embassy to try to give this up. And by the way, even though it's my country, it's my government, and I love it, the American embassy is absolutely useless. All they were doing was basically copying and pasting what's on either the Foreign Ministry of Israel's website and just giving it to me, and kept telling me, well, Jordanians need a visa. I must have repeated to them 6 times, I'm not a Jordanian.
Kamal,
I'm not a Jordanian.
Sorry to interrupt you, Kamal, but I want to give Leora a chance to respond to this issue of dual nationals.
I'm not a national. That's the thing. I'm not a dual national. I'm not a dual national.
We understand, but I want her to talk about this, the way people are being treated that have Jordanian passports, because the inquiry in the COGAT policy is whether or not you have a Jordanian travel document. They actually don't ask you if you're a citizen. But Leora, could you just clarify really quickly on this particular point? And I want to ask some follow-up questions. So if you could do it briefly.
You're on mute, Leora.
Mute. Kamal's case is not unusual. This was practice under the old policy, and my office had been seeing cases like this since probably 2015-16. In the summer of 2022, they went hard on anyone who had a Jordanian travel document. The new policy has says Americans have the U.S. has diplomatic ties with Israel. They fall under this policy for foreign entry. However, there's an appendix to the policy. The appendix says we have a list of 5 countries. These countries also have diplomatic ties with Israel, but we're going to treat them as if they don't. And so for these 5 countries, they aren't entitled to all the privileges of this policy, and they have to go. They're diverted to a different policy, which is much more restrictive, that essentially doesn't allow anyone to enter. What are the countries? Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, Bahrain, and South Sudan. So if we have a national, first of all, I'm going to say national of any one of these countries, they, even though they're from countries with diplomatic ties, they are not allowed to enter under this visa scheme of this policy. However, the policy doesn't only say nationals. It says nationals. It says persons born in those countries. And there is a third category that was basically, it was written in, it was removed, it was returned. The current version of the policy from December 2022, it says persons carrying documents from one of these 5 countries. And it applies to dual nationals. So if you have a U.S. citizen who carries documents from Jordan, and there are thousands upon thousands of Palestinian Americans who carry Jordanian documents because they are in a situation very similar to Kamal's, and they have a Jordanian travel document that does not show that they're a national, they are denied entry under this policy. They are considered Jordanian, just like Kamal was treated not as an American. They are not treated as Americans Israel does not care that the person is carrying a U.S. passport. They don't care if the Jordanian travel document is expired. The person is Jordanian, and they say turn around and go home.
So effectively, Leora, because as Kamal noted, most Palestinians of a certain generation are going to have Jordanian travel documents. This effectively sort of cuts off that entire generation from visiting the occupied territories. You know, so yes, thank you for that clarification. I have a question about. Sorry. Okay, go ahead, Kamal.
Yeah, and this is why I came here today, because I think I you know, when I talked to the embassy, and the embassy said the same thing, the U.S. embassy, what Leora said, they said, well, they talked to the people in Israel, and Israel said, well, this is a policy they've had for a long time, but then they just now started to enforce it, and I felt that, you know, maybe they were using this to get around the requirements of the visa waiver program. Because if the visa waiver program allows them, requires them to provide Americans with reciprocity, and they need that to get into the visa waiver program, I felt that maybe this is a way to get around that by saying, well, we're not rejecting Americans, we're rejecting Jordanians. And even though we're not really Jordanians, and I thought maybe that they were trying to get around this, but the most difficult part of it is that, you know, they said you can come back. You have to go give that up, which I'm sure any Palestinians have no problem with giving that up because it doesn't provide us with any benefits. But the thing is, Jordan doesn't give you proof that you gave it up. And so the only thing I was able to do was just mail the passport. Just mail it to the ambassador with a certified card that I got back, but it doesn't say what it is I mailed. Now, I'm planning to go back this year. I don't really know, having listened to both Jessica and Leora, I'm still not sure how I need to do that. We were thinking of separating from my family, them going from the West Bank, me going either from Egypt or Ben Gurion, to see if that will make anything better. I have no proof that I gave up the passport. And the other reason I came here today is I've been like following this real closely for several years. And one of the things that I'm constantly hearing Israeli politicians say, and I'd like Leora and Jessica to comment on this, is many of them talk about, okay, we let them transit through Israel to go to the West Bank. And I've heard several, Knesset members talking at some point, and I don't know if this is the official policy of Israel. They're saying, well, we're not letting these Palestinian Americans into Israel. We're just letting them transit, meaning they can come in through Ben Gurion Airport. They get into a special taxi that doesn't allow them to get out of that taxi until they get to Bethlehem or Ramallah or wherever they need to go. That when the ambassador of the U.S. who spoke the other day, it seemed like, this wouldn't be acceptable. But I've heard several Israeli politicians talking about, even if we accept this, all they're allowing us to do is transit, which means we're not allowed to enter Israel. We just get a chance to go to Ben Gurion. And I'm not sure, according to Leora and Jessica, under the new rules, are we allowed to go into Israel, or are we allowed to use Ben Gurion Airport? And how does someone like me, how can I get in this time? I've already bought my ticket, not knowing if I can get in or not.
The current rules are you cannot use Ben Gurion Airport to transit to the West Bank. The current rules say if you are only coming for a visit to the West Bank, you can only come in through the crossing with Jordan, the Allenby Bridge. The Ben Gurion, Israel's airport, is for the mixed visits. If you're coming to visit Israel and the West Bank, or people who are coming to Israel, or people who are coming to settlements. So either those Israeli officials are not accurate, are not well informed, or are misleading when they say that you can use. Perhaps they're talking about some future negotiations around how they're going to, convince the U.S. that there is reciprocity. Some new arrangement, these taxis that you mentioned. Currently, no, they are not allowing people to use Ben Gurion.
Thank you, Jessica. We are unfortunately out of time, and I've got a slew of questions that deal with who is responsible, or what status do Palestinians that hold Jerusalem ID, are they considered Israeli nationals, or are they, where do they fall in all of this? There's questions about, how is the Jordanian government intervening? There's questions about, all the other countries that are listed that actually have peace agreements or have normalized with Israel, that are on the list of countries that have no possibility of having tourism come in. And if they're dual nationals, even the U.S. citizenship, as Kamal noted, doesn't save them. But unfortunately, we can't answer those questions. And we did want to talk about as well, what is someone to do? Who do they contact? And what we've been told by the U.S. Authorities is that, you need to really email the American Citizen Services with your stories. So everyone who has a story to tell should be sending that to them, so that the U.S. government officials can get to work on figuring out how to fix this problem, so that Israel can gain access to the visa waiver program, and Palestinians can benefit as well with unrestricted entry. I want to thank all of you, my panelists and experts, for joining me, and especially to Kamal and Samar for sharing your stories. I know that's very difficult to do. It's very personal, but I really appreciate you doing that. And I want to thank all of you who have been sharing your stories in the comment box. We'll be sure to print those out and send them along. And thanks everyone else for joining us. And with that, goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaha.